Hello, I am Lisette and my partner is Mirari, and we are going to explain some differences that have been found about how we acquire a second language. And specifically, we are going to focus on each. Does it really matter? There's a lot of research regarding this area. And um, a lot of there are many of the research that states that adults are better learners because they basically learn faster. However, it is also very important to note that there are other authors that mention and explain that adult learners also struggle with phonolo- phonological aspects such as their pronunciation. And for children do not have usually do not have this issue. And for this factor and other characteristics, there are many researchers that consider that children are the ones who are better learners, at least for acquiring a second language. So we're going to see how does age influence our acquisition of a second language. And as we can see in the image on our right, acquisition has different paths. And according to your age, and there you are going to it's more likely that you are going to choose different learning mechanisms and processes in comparison to children. So we are going to analyze some studies that specifically focused on the factor of age. And there are very clear patterns that were found when you divide the researches between short term and long term. Long term studies really focused more on ultimate attainment, which really benefits children as the better second language learners because basically ultimate attainment is like basically excelling at all the factors that a language has, all the aspects in long term, basically in your life that you won't forget after not practicing the language. Usually, children who, well, basically people who are very young and were exposed to the language are accent free, which basically means that their performance using the language is very native like, even if the language that we are talking about is the second one, not their mother tongue. On the other hand, we have short term studies, which focus more on the rate of acquisition, which basically means how quickly a learner acquires the language. And as we stated before, adults are the ones who benefit from that. The adults are usually the ones who learn faster. And there are several reasons why. First of all, when you get older, your cognitive processes, your cognitive skills also mature. So that obviously helps when you are acquiring a language. And also you become wiser specifically when taking tests or the way that you are tested to see how proficient you are using a language. So this author here says that I cannot see. It says that they made a study where they evaluated second language acquisition, and they saw the language use in content areas that didn't necessarily focus on English. And they saw that the adult learners had a better performance. And one of the reasons were because, well, they had better academic skills. They are older, they have like a better idea of how to excel academically. And this, like, this author deduced that the strategies that these learners developed in their first language, all those strategies, they translated them into their usage of their second language. So that like acts like a pro when they are in their development in the second language. However, there is a con for adults, and that usually is that they tend the knowledge that they acquire, it's more likely for them to forget it in the future. It doesn't stick as like second nature for them as if they learned all of that when they were children. So now we're going to analyze some studies. First, we have the one made by Asher and Price, and they studied 134 students, and they basically for 25 minutes they used TPR to teach some vocabulary. And what happened? Well, the subjects were children from 8 to 12 years old against college age adults. So basically, what happened was that adults have a better performance, which basically agrees with what we said before. Adults have like an advantage when we are talking about short term. Something they are faster learners than if they have less time, and you are comparing their performance with children, they will be better. Then we also have a study, the study of Snow and Nigel from 1978. They were studying Dutch. Well, the use of Dutch in English speaking students, and basically the naturalistic acquisition of those of the subject. These people who were being studied were children, teens, and adults. And in this study, they were measuring pronunciation, morphology, and imitation and translation. So, what happened? So, basically, first, they, all of the people who they were studying, they moved to Holland, and they were studied for a little bit less than a year, like 10 months, around 10 months. And when they checked what was the progress of both groups of all the groups, they noticed that after 3 to 6 months, the teens and adults outperform the children after spending that amount of time in said country. However, a few months later, like when they had 9 months in Holland, the the children began to perform basically at the same level as the teens and adults. So they began to catch up with them. And not only that, their pronunciation was better than the teens and the adults. So eh, now we are going to analyze the study of Tata, Wood, and the other author. Basically, they were studying 5 to 15 years old in an English school, and they were asked to imitate French and Armenian. Basically, very short phrases or simple words. In what happened? Basically, they found that among the people that they were studying, um, their ability to uh, pronounce, basically their ability of pronouncing words declines steadily. No, declined steadily when their age increased. So basically, when they get older, their ability of pronunciation began to decrease in the same with the same amount of like level. And well, but before starting to decrease, the children who were from 5 to 8 years old, they managed to have a really good pronunciation. Like basically, they were able to imitate almost perfectly the words that they were asked to repeat. But when from 8 to 11, that's when their ability to do that, to imitate, started to decrease more and more. But then from 11 to 15, uh, from that low here in that level, it started to get steady again, like a constant level of performance among that age group. And the reverse of this evolution is also true for the amount of times that they asked again to be modeled what they had to repeat, and the amount of times that they had to well, they attempted to pronounce those words. So the older they were, the more they were asking to have more chances to have a better performance. Then, for the following research, we have crashing. In it basically they they basically state what it has already been mentioned, that adults in their early stages of learning have an easier time, they learn faster, specifically synthetic and morphological developments, whereas well, and in addition, older children acquire faster than people who are younger. And basically, one of the main constraints that we can appreciate in these researches is that specifically when the subjects began being older than 6 years old, they struggle more with pronunciation. Specifically, they began struggling with suprasegmental phonology, which is basically, well, pronouncing phrases, sentences, something longer than words and phonemes. And then they start to struggle with the well, shorter sounds. So then let me move to the next slide here. So after analyzing and reflecting on all the previous information and research, uh, we can, and also Lindenberg deduced the existence of something called critical period. And what is that? Basically, that there's an age where people are more open to easily acquire a language in the same level as a native speaker. And basically, this would also imply that after this critical period passes, basically the complete mastery as a native speaker is basically impossible. There are some people who believe that. And there are others that instead of such a definite critical period, they prefer to describe a more sensitive period, does which basically explains that there's a period in someone's life, usually when they are younger, where where the acquisition of a second language is more efficient. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to acquire the language in such a level when that period ends, but it's easier if you do it in that range. Then, as we mentioned before, ultimate attainment is basically it gives more weight to the absolute abilities rather than specifically the learning speed. And well, as we saw in the previous research, younger learners, younger starters consistently outperform older ones in this regard. They end up with a native like attainment since their brain is more flexible. And when a person begins acquiring the language later than the age of 6, they start to have more accent, and it's more difficult to acquire the language with a native like proficiency. Then here we have two research. The first one was made by Oyama, and he basically studied some Italian immigrants and focused specifically on the age they arrived. There were some kids that arrived when they were very young, and others when they were adult teenagers. They what this study showed was that children perform basically essentially as native speakers, whereas the older learners were not able to get to that level. Then we have the study of Mayer, which basically uses the critical period hypothesis is about specifically about the regard of accents. In He used people who were from Brazil and some native speaker. The people from Brazil were older people, adults basically, who were learning English, and then the other group of participants were native speakers but children. So basically, he asked them to pronounce some words, and then he asked some native speakers to be the judges and basically classify, no, to rate the performance of the pronunciations to see if they noticed an accent, a foreign accent. And the results were that none of the non-native speakers received a higher score than the lowest native speakers who were children. So this only shows that even if you try to learn the language, you will most likely have an accent if you learn it after the critical period, and that a child will probably perform better than you. Therefore, we can conclude in at least in this part, that phonological attainment is strongly conditioned by the age of the learner. Basically, it's almost impossible to achieve a native like accent if you try to acquire the language when you are older, and it's really important, therefore, to have a lot of exposure of said language when you are younger, when you are still in this critical period. And there's one more study from Nefeld, and he basically concluded that accent free second language performance is possible, and that there's no sensitive period for second language acquisition. However, this study is not very reliable for several reasons. Eh, in in the text that we analyze, it even says that this study, this research, is no good for generalizing the results in how everyone acquires a language. Why? Because the subjects that this person chose for his study were people were who had really good education in their bilingual process. They were bilingual, no any type of bilingual. They were really proficient in both languages. And they were asked, as the previous study, to imitate, to pronounce certain words, certain phrases, and some native speakers were asked to identify who was a native speaker and who wasn't. And there were many of the other subjects that did pass as native speakers. However, we have to consider that the samples that these subjects participants gave were really short. So it was not the best example for to show their proficiency in spontaneous language, which is basically how we almost always use the language. And they were also allowed to re-record their samples. So if they felt like it was not good enough, they could record again until they were satisfied, which is usually not how communication works. And well, basically the samples were carefully picked, and that's why the study is not very reliable, because after all, if we want to see how well a second language was acquired, we should be focusing more on how the participants are able to fool the native speakers in, well, in longer sentences, in something more spontaneous rather than carefully picked. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to present the results of the investigations. In the NIFL investigation, it was relevant that the non-native speakers can achieve high levels of pronunciation if they have, well, the pronunciation of the foreign language, if they have sufficient exposure and practice of the language. Well, another study is the Scoville investigation, in which here the evaluates the ability of the children and adults to recognize foreign accents in speech and writing samples. Well, here we have the Ojama investigation. He mentioned that children who arrive to immigrant children who arrive to another country at the age of 11 years old show abilities similar to the native speakers, whilst other ones who arrive to another with another ages has a progressively a lower performance. Finally, we have the Patrosky investigation, in which one is based on the syntactic, and he mentions that people who arrive, younger people who arrive to the United States, have a better language mastery because of they have the opportunity to acquire in a younger age the language. Well, now I'm going to explain the explanations for age-related differences. These ones are divided in four principles. The first one is the social psychological explanation. I understand that adult people create an identity based on the first language. When they want to learn the second language, they feel that they lose their identity. So, for that reason, when they want to speak in their second language, as an example, in English, they use the accent of their first language, for example, here, Spanish, to feel that they continue with this identity. When we acquire the language, we have two perspectives. The first one is the inhibition, where adults feel afraid to make mistakes, and the second one is the children's perspective when they feel open to acquire the language. Okay, so then we have the resistance to socialization. As adults already have their own identity, it is complicated for them to receive new information of knowledge about another cultures, as it is necessary to acquire the second language. But in the contrary, we have the children perspective that they are in the process of create an identity, and they have the adaptability to receive this information to create based on what they are learning their own identity. Okay, then we have the cognitive explanation. Here the children use the language acquisition device that help them to acquire easily the language. On the contrary, we have the abstract mentality of the adults and the solving problem ability that unfortunately don't help them to acquire the language. Okay, then we have the input explanation. The input is an easy way of acquire the language, and we have to give them opportunities of practicing by playing, for example. And at the moment that we give them this kind of inputs, we can provide um, a complete way to acquire the language, and at the end they can produce it, and they will master the language. Finally, we have neurological explanation. Here we can find the critical period. The brain becomes more flexible and can be adapted in the easy way to new language, to acquire a new language before the puberty. And then this, well, the brain change and the hemispheres starting to mastering in different topics. So after that becomes a process called call it laceration, that limits the capacity of the brain to learn the language. And something that happened here is that each hemisphere interchange informations, so that makes that the new language becomes more difficult to acquire. Yes.